Hello, everyone. So here we are, starting Unit 3. Hopefully, you've had a chance to become familiar with the basics, the brain basics from last unit. But just in case you didn't, I wanted to start Unit 3 with a basic review of the different parts of the brain, how we orient ourselves in space with the brain when we're talking about the brain, and maybe this will be a review. Maybe this will answer some of your remaining lingering questions. But hopefully that we will start on the same page as we go into some of the more specific units. This unit we will be talking about the somatosensory nervous system. So how do we interpret sensory information? How do we interpret that in our brains? How does that message get sent to the parts of our brain? And where does it go? So to start us off, just a couple of more terms. So in the first unit, we talked about how we have terminology like coronal, sagittal, and axial when we're talking about different slices of the brain. Those are really important when we're talking about brain imaging technology, obviously, because you want to know exactly what view you're looking at so that you can kind of give yourself a two-dimensional rendering of a three-dimensional object like our brain. A couple other words that help when we're talking in terms of direction and anatomy are anterior and posterior. Anterior, obviously, you need to be able to orient yourself in terms of what's forward. So anterior means front. It's going to be the front of your head, where your forehead would be. Posterior would be the back of your head, and that would be where your skull ends. And then we have words like inferior and superior and inferior that I might refer to just to give you an idea. Superior just means what you think of as it's above, and then inferior will be below. So whenever we're talking about structures that are above or below, those would be the words. And when we're talking about the human brain, the most magnificent thing about the human brain and the reason why we have such incredible processing speeds and such incredible amounts of information being stored and processed in our brains is because of the fact that we have this ginormous cerebral cortex. While it seems like we don't have, this enormous brain, the fact is that the brain tissue itself, if you were to flatten it out, would be much larger than it is, like a giant pizza pie. The brain actually folds back on itself, and so you get something that looks really wrinkly and has hills and valleys, and that's what we call the cerebral cortex, which gives us that incredible amount of processing area. The cerebral cortex then is going to be highlighted right here, right in there. So that's your cerebral cortex. That is what you think of. It's just on the outside, all around the ridges and grooves. And then the gray-white matter will be the stuff on the inside. When we talk about white matter, the interesting thing is, if you've never really stopped and thought about it before, our axons, when they myelinate, they turn white. And so basically all the inside of a brain is the inner part. After the cerebral cortex is just billions and billions of neurons that have been myelinated. The axons have been myelinated so that they're tails. They're basically just myelinated tails that are connections from the outside to various parts of the inside of the brain so that different messages can be sent on this mega highway of information so basically on the top of your brain, information gets processed, and then everything in the middle is actually just very fast highways, all myelinated with, super speed information kind of going through the axons from tail to tail. The gyrus, or the hilly areas right here, are what we talk about when we talk about the peaks, and then the valleys right here will be the sulcus. So there are two sulci that I want you to be aware of, mostly because they help you understand the different lobes. So, okay, this is a picture of the lobes that you were supposed to become somewhat familiar with when you were flipping around in Unit 2. We have our, some of this terminology will become clear in just a few seconds. The anterior, obviously the front, this is going to be the precentral gyrus. The frontal lobe, the very front part of your brain is called the frontal lobe. Interestingly enough, brain terminology often comes from either obvious things like it's in the front, so it's going to be called the frontal lobe, or Later on, when we're talking about certain neurotransmitters and addiction, we know about certain neurotransmitters and addiction because of the drug and because of addiction itself. And we, for instance, later on, we might talk about the nicotinic receptor. We called it the nicotinic receptor because of the fact that it reacts with, or it interacts with nicotine. So it's a weird naming system. It's kind of like what came first, the receptor or the thing. But a lot of the names for these things are actually kind of interesting. The posterior, okay, so I told you that there are going to be a couple of sulcuses that you need to remember. The main one, the central sulcus is right there. The central sulcus, it's basically the center of your brain. There is a ridge, and so we orient all brains with the central sulcus right there. And this part of the brain is going to be called the frontal lobe, and then so precentral gyrus is basically just in front of the central sulcus. Postcentral gyrus is going to be behind the central sulcus. And then there will be right here, it's going to be harder to see in this picture, but there will be also something called the lateral sulcus, and that is, lateral just means sideways, so you're going to have a very big sulcus or a very big groove, and that's going to orient that's going to kind of split the brain into a top and a bottom half. So we've got our prefrontal lobe, which is the front part of the brain right here. That's the frontal, frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and all that stuff that is in charge of higher order and executive order thinking, so decision making, everything that kind of makes up our personality, really, and speech is going to be in here too. So basically, everything that makes us higher order beings is going to be located in the prefrontal cortex. This area right here is what we're going to actually spend quite a bit of time talking about in this unit, which is going to include the somatosensory area of the brain, and that's going to be called the parietal lobe. This lobe right here actually has both the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, so the receiving part and then also the part that helps us actually do stuff. The occipital lobe is back here. The occipital lobe is right above the bottom part of your brain. The occipital lobe is right in the back of your head. If you were to put your hand kind of where, like just right at the back of your head, that's where your occipital lobe is, at the back of your skull. The occipital lobe is actually just the visual processing center of your brain. So all the images, which is really strange, it's going to come in through your eyeballs, but it's going to reflect onto the back part of your brain, just kind of like an old movie projector, and you're going to interpret visual image back there. Interestingly enough, the visual image usually comes out something upside down like this, and your brain actually interprets it so that it flips it upside down, which is pretty cool. The temporal lobe, which is the last one right here, this is going to be your temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe is going to be where you have your auditory processing center, and also a major component of this area is going to be language processing. Just keep in mind, I just sat through a really interesting talk from one of the leading researchers of learning and memory, and remember that parts of your brain are always associated with one thing. We call them day jobs. All these parts of the brain are in charge of these major functions that we know of, but also when they are not doing the function that we think of. For instance, when we're not listening to something, the temporal lobe also has a night job, or it has something else it's doing. So when we're talking about learning and memory, we might actually refer back to these areas to link other things that this part of the brain might do when it's in its off mode. For instance, you might be able to, in the temporal lobe, be processing auditory information, but again, language and the ability to process sounds in meaningful ways also happens in this area. So there's a lot of overlap. I'll just say that for now. So another picture, here we go. So the central sulcus, again, right here, so it orients us to see what is in front of us. The central sulcus will split the brain. Interestingly enough, the parietal lobe starts back here, but here we've got our, so it's linked, but the motor cortex is actually, I misspoke. The motor cortex is actually going to be in the frontal lobe. It's sitting right next to the sensory perception area, which is going to be the sensory motor region. But the motor cortex is going to be in the frontal lobe, and then behind it, right next to it, is actually going to be the somatosensory association area, which is where we start to perceive the different touch, feel, taste, all those different sensory experiences will be processed in this area, this blue area right here. In your frontal lobe, I will publish these slides so you can print them or take a closer look at them. But just really quickly, the frontal lobe is basically where everything that you think of as socially acceptable behavior happens. So you have your Broca's area, which is your speech center. So you might I'm sorry, you have your Broca's area. You might hear that word or hear about that area. The Broca's area is where we learn what is associated with speech. So our ability to speak is in the frontal lobe. Obviously, the frontal eye field, your visual field starts, is going to be in your prefrontal or your frontal cortex. Your prefrontal lobe is personality, intellect, learning, reasoning, judgment, mood, recall, intuition, abstraction. Basically, what makes us human in a lot of ways is going to be in that front part of your brain. So say you fall really, really hard on the front of your head. When people say they have prefrontal cortex damage, oftentimes you will see socially aberrant behavior. I had a friend of mine fall mountain climbing, damaged his prefrontal cortex, and always, always, always very aware that he was very different because he would say things that were completely inappropriate or would act totally inappropriate or would have emotional outbursts. Basically what you'd think of as a tantruming toddler because of the fact that once you damage this part of your brain, you don't have the ability to have this ability to reason. In your somatosensory area, so we've talked about that. The occipital lobe receives the visual information. Oh, one last thing you might hear about this area, so we might come back to this time permitting. Wernicke's area is also an area that is commonly talked about because of aphasias. Broca's areas, so if you were to have damage in this part, in the frontal part of your brain, in the posterior part of the frontal cortex, which is going to be where Broca's area is located, you might find that you would be able to understand language, but you wouldn't be able to speak it. If you were to have an aphasia or you were to have some damage to the Wernicke's area, you would be able to sound like you were saying something, or you would be able to make noises that sound like language, but it would be meaningless because in Wernicke's area is where we understand now that speech is interpreted. So it's an interesting phenomenon when you are diagnosing different aphasias of stroke victims or people who have traumatic brain injuries. You might be able to see and understand that an object is what it is and not be able to say it, and that would be damage to the Broca's area. So it's just an aside. All right, so more about just the structure of the brain. I apologize that we're going to go through this. So, some of you might have already gone through this, but sometimes it's nice to just kind of walk through it again. So the cortex is all the stuff on the outside, and then I talked about how the white matter is all the stuff that as you kind of go through the brain. There are also interior parts of the brain that are incredibly important, and so while we did mention the lobes probably in Unit 2, I'm not sure if any of you did some further research into some other parts of the brain, but there are other structures that we will talk about a lot when we're talking about learning and memory and addiction. This is kind of more of the less developed. I mean, they're very, very important structures, but some say that evolutionarily speaking, these are kind of the more animal parts of our brain. The diencephalon is the mid area right here. So if you look at that, the diencephalon is that it's right in the center. It's right in the middle of where you would think of as the brain. The diencephalon is going to be encapsulated by the cortex and some other stuff and some ventricles. Ventricles are mentioned, but they're basically just like cerebral fluid-filled sacs that kind of go around these structures. But basically, the insides of the brain are going to be made up of ventricles and some of these structures. The diencephalon is the house of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. The thalamus is an incredibly important structure because it's kind of like the liaison between the cortex and many other parts of the brain. So the little thing here says, it relays sensory information to the sensory cortex, motor information from the cerebellum to the basal ganglia to the frontal cortex. Basically, it communicates between the major players in the brain and the receptors, which are on the outside. So it's kind of like an air traffic control tower. So it determines a lot of times where the signals are going to go. The hypothalamus is incredibly important in emotional states, all the things that you think of when you're the autonomic system, the pituitary gland, which is a hormonal gland that controls hormone regulation, emotional states, eating, drinking, sexual activity, circadian rhythms, sleep, wake cycle. So basically, what regulates us hormonally, what regulates us with sleep, and what regulates us to reproduce. So all of that stuff is going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is actually the melatonin. If you've ever heard that word before, it is known to help in sleeping. So having a depleted melatonin supply would mean that you have some sleep issues, and so a lot of times they might prescribe some melatonin as a sleep aid if you need to reestablish some of your sleep cycles, if you're an insomniac or if you're having trouble sleeping. So the diencephalon is kind of like basically what makes us an animal. So how we eat, sleep, reproduce, and how we respond, our reflexive experience. The cerebellum on the bottom part is right here. The cerebellum is under where you would think of as like it's right next to it. It protects the brainstem. It is important for balance. It helps. The information that is processed there helps us to basically not run into walls and not fall down all the time. It gives us it coordinates voluntary movements of skeletal muscles. It basically just makes sure that we don't fall over. Which is also very good. It kind of helps us understand like our position relative to things. Your brain stem is actually going to be made out of three components: your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla oblongata. I'm not sure if we'll spend too much time talking about the brainstem, but obviously the brainstem is an incredibly important piece of equipment in our bodies, and so therefore it's entirely, if you look at it, it's entirely encapsulated by the different parts of your brain. So your neck would be here, and so basically there's like all of this stuff that protects it, because any damage to the brainstem so if you're going to go in order of importance, the brainstem is what gives you life. The diencephalon gives you the ability to live, reproduce, be alive, and then in the back part of your brain, the cerebellum, keeps you, able to stand up and not run into things and accidentally get yourself in trouble. And then everything on the outside gives you kind of the experience of life. So it kind of becomes, there have been people that say that, this part of the brain is way animal and this part of the brain gives us what we think of as a human experience. You can think what you like. You can think of it as an evolutionary design. But basically the brainstem keeps us alive. So the midbrain, the midbrain contains sensory and motor tracts, controls movement of the head, eyes, trunk in response to visual and auditory stimuli, the erosion of the cranial nerves. The pons will also have, an ability to receive some of the information coming from the different sensory parts of our brain. And the medulla oblongata is very, very important for the regulation of our autonomic nervous system. So basically, our involuntary movements, so our heart, our breathing, blood, so that we live and breathe and don't just stop breathing, so that we stay alive. So obviously, if you snap your spine or you have a traumatic brain injury where you damage the brainstem, we all know that you can become a vegetable. You can have different parts that, if damage to one side of the brainstem, would actually create a vegetative state where you completely lose consciousness, and the damage to another part of your medulla oblongata might just create paraplegia or quadriplegia where you're still there. So maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about that later on also. Okay, so this is The basic route of the information from the different parts of your body. This is an introductory neurophysiology, neuropsychology course, so we're not really going to go into the specific names of all of these different pathways, but just know that there are actually names and for these different routes that the nerves can go through, and there are lots and lots of different ways. So there's when the nervous system interpret signals from the same side versus cross sides like these. There's actually names for them all, and so hopefully if you take further neural classes, you can learn all of those. But for now, this is the basic mechanism of action for a nerve impulse coming from somewhere other than the central nervous system. So you have receptors for touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception, or all those different things. So everything that you think of when you think of an external stimuli. So proprioception is actually just a really fancy way of saying kinesthesia. So, how do you feel in reference to other things? So, movement, anything you think of as like a movement, a physical experience, is going to be your kinesthetic feeling. Your brain actually interprets both external and internal at the same time. So, how your heart, how you're breathing, how your internal systems are functioning and are experiencing this situation, and how your external like your sense of touch, taste, and pain and all that stuff, your brain will actually interpret all of those and send a signal kind of combined, which is actually pretty incredible. So the basic function is this. From your external, whatever it is, so your hand, your foot, your stomach, you're going to have a nerve cell that's going to run to the central nervous system, and that's going to be the first order neuron. The first order neuron is going to be, they call it posterior root ganglion. So you might hear words like ganglion or ganglia and nuclei. They're basically the same thing. The ganglia or the ganglion is going to be what we call a nerve cell that's in the peripheral nervous, or not actually in the central nervous system. So you're going to have these long axons that are going to be attached to receptors that are somewhere else in your body. And then once you're in the central nervous system, they're actually called nuclei. So just kind of they're pretty much the same thing. So then you've got your second order neuron. So basically the first order neuron brings the signal to the central nervous, or brings it to the spinal cord, where you're going to connect to another neuron, the second order neuron. So you've got your peripheral nervous system that's going to attach to the brain stem, and once you're in the brain, then you get to carries it all the way to the thalamus. Once information gets to the thalamus, again, this is kind of like the landing, or it's going to be the auxiliary tower, so it's going to send out information to where it needs to go. And so from there, you get your third order neuron, and the signal goes to where it needs to go. And the most incredible thing is that on the primary somatosensory area, the cerebral cortex, you have different receptor sites for every single possible thing that you can think of. So taste will go one place, sound will go to another, yeah, so it's pretty incredible. So you've got your flight trafficker in the thalamus that's going to direct traffic for you. Okay, so another way to think about it, so you've obviously got your receptors going in one direction, so you're going to have information kind of traveling up in one way, and then you can probably figure out that the information kind of relays back in the same way. So it's as you think, so you're going to have information from your primary, so your sensory experience is going to go all the way over there, and then your motor cortex is going to be signaling back the other way. So you get your information, it's going to go receive into the sensory cortex, where it's going to interpret everything that you're experiencing, and the motor cortex is going to respond accordingly. So this is just an image of somebody writing, so you don't really think about it too much, but there's a lot going on when you're writing, right? So, excuse me, I'm writing for no reason. So you have things like, when you're righty or lefty, people always talk about like, which side of the brain are you on? So you've got you're holding your pen, you're holding your pencil, and you've got both graded potentials and nerve action potentials going on at the same time. So your physical experience is actually many things happening at once. Graded potentials are very similar to nerve action potentials, except for they're less. So negative 70 millivolts is going to be the resting potential for both different kinds of potentials. They're both just electrical differences over a membrane. A graded potential will just be a signal that is not firing at thresholds. So when you hit negative 50 because of the ion channel gradient, right? Negative 50 is that magic number. You get an action potential, right? So action potentials are going to happen when you have enough of a stimulus. Graded potentials might happen when you're not at negative 50, so they'll just continue to happen, kind of a low, dull experience. But the interesting thing about a graded potential is that if a graded potential happens and it's low voltage, and then another graded potential might happen before the first graded potential is over. So say you have something like this, and then before that first one ends, another one fires, and then another one fires. What can end up happening is that they can all add together to have a total potential difference that's great enough for an action potential to fire. So why this is important is that, say in a localized area right here, you're having many, many, many information signals going at once. If you have many signals going at once, you might get an action potential to fire because of the cumulative effect of the stimulus itself. So graded potentials are occurring because there's all these different mechanical signals that are going along here. But over time, you might also get action potentials, and once that happens, obviously the signal can perpetuate all the way up to the brain. So that's kind of cool. And then obviously in the reverse, you're going to have muscle action potential. So then the cerebral cortex says, hey, I'm holding a pen. I am squeezing the pen. It is responding with a certain feeling. I know what this is. And then it sends a message back that says, okay, do your job, muscles. Retract around the pencil, move in this certain way. So you have all these things happening all at once when you are writing, which is one cool thing, right? Just a cool little, you see these little diagrams kind of in every neuro textbook. I think they're a little bit weird, but it's basically the different part of your primary somatosensory cortex, what's in charge of what. So like on the right, this is a picture of the frontal plane through the postcentral gyrus. So it's going to be, if it's a postcentral gyrus, it's going to be behind. So that's obviously the sensory part. So the sensory part is going to be, so information from, which is so weird right here. So that's going to be like your face. So you got your nose, your face, your upper lip, your lip, things like that. And then, which is funny, if you think about like the proportion of things, so if you look at it, you've got like a small little sliver is going to be from your teeth, gum, and jaw. Your tongue, your pharynx, your intra-abdominal is actually pretty big, right? So like what you taste. And then your eye is actually the smallest receptor area, and your lips, or your lips is huge, right? So it's kind of an interesting proportion, but I mean, I leave that to you to figure out the evolutionary purpose of why parts of our brain are dedicated to this. But I would venture to say that survival is more dependent on the fact that we should be able to taste things that might be harmful to us than maybe see. I don't know. Maybe we'll talk about that in a discussion question. Anyway, so you've got your hands. Look at that. I mean, your hands take up a huge part of your brain. And then all the way down here, which is kind of funny, you've got your genitals and your foot, leg, and toes and all that stuff. Which is kind of funny because I would venture to say that, in this day and age, that you would actually not think that survival would be so independent of some of these things and so more dependent on other things. But I, again, leave that to you to think about from an evolutionary standpoint. Again, over here, this is the precentral gyrus. So you've got, this is what makes you move after you get information. It's pretty opportune that you get, information gets sent here, and then right next door, information is processed and then sent back out. So on the outside, on the prefrontal side, it's almost exactly the same. So you've got your motor cortex almost proportionally exactly the same. You've got your mouth, face, and all that good stuff. But the interesting thing on this side is that your vocalization area is huge. So our ability to speak and our ability to use our hands takes up a good portion of our brain. It's pretty incredible if you think about it. So I would venture to say that like what makes us human might be the fact that we can speak and the fact that we have this opposable thumb. On that quiz thing, you can actually maybe think about these things when you pick your favorite sense. All right, so in this course, we have decided, myself and the other teacher have decided that we're going to focus mostly on the light aspect or the optics. Most of the senses, touch, taste, hearing, and vision work similarly. Vision is probably what I think is the most interesting in terms of all of the things that go on with your brain. So we're going to talk about eyesight most, and hopefully, if you have questions about the other senses, they all work pretty similarly. Information gets sent and then it gets transcribed in your brain, and processed. The eyes are kind of cool though, in that the way that information is received and processed is so incredible. So you've heard this before. So the light will come in and will hit your eyes and it'll go into, oops. So light will come in and it'll shine into your eyes, right? So you're looking at a picture, you're looking at something. And so if you guys have taken physics, this is actually incredible when you're thinking about convex and concave images. What ends up happening then in your retina, at the back of your eye, you're going to have rods and cones that are going to interpret some of that information, and then action potentials are going to be generated from those rods and cones and then sent back opposite of where it came from. So if you're getting visual information from, the left eyeball, it's going to be processed, or it's going to be imaged on the right side of your brain. And then again, the right eyeball is going to have its image displayed on the left side of the brain, which is kind of weird, right? The other cool thing is, what is true about vision is that it's not that my right eye is only seeing, things, and it's going to only go to my left. Like, they're going to have overlapping visual fields, which is pretty cool. So you've got like this kind of visual field, and you've got this kind of visual field. I don't know if this picture is doing any justice here, but the left eye and the right eye actually overlap in what they see. So while my left eye might see a certain amount of information and my right eye sees a certain amount of information, there is an area where the information does overlap. So it's kind of it spans, like your eyeballs actually span space instead of actually looking directly at an object, which is so cool. So you're going to have this visual information cross across your brain, and then you have this processing where like the two images are going to overlay each other, and then usually your image is upside down like this, and then it gets flipped over in your fovea, and so then you can see images right side up. There are some interesting studies where if you wear a pair of glasses that flip the world upside down kind of on purpose, over time your brain, I think it only takes like 2 weeks, your brain will actually adjust and see it right side up like it's supposed to, which is incredible, right? All right, so further, so just a little bit more about the eye, and I'll give you an opportunity to do some more research and look a little bit more into some different aphasias and different things that might happen when there are things that are wrong with vision. The mechanics of vision are actually pretty straightforward. I think the cooler stuff kind of happens when the visual information is somehow mixed up or confused when it gets to the processing center of the brain. So right now, I think we'll just talk about the mechanics, and then we'll get a little bit more into the various cool case studies of how, like prosopagnosia, which I'm just going to give a plug for that one because I just think it's so incredibly cool. There's an area of the brain that is specifically for facial recognition. And so when the information is missing in that area of the brain, people actually can't see faces. They can see a head, they understand there's a face, the visual information is going into their brain, and yet they can't recognize faces. It's just blurry, which is so interesting. So that's actually just one example, but there are some other cool ones. And of course, the big thing that I haven't mentioned in any of this discussion of this metasensory cortex is the discussion of, it's not just the mechanical part that is so incredible about the brain processing centers. The integration of the limbic system with some of the sensory motor stuff is so cool. The limbic system is an area that is associated with everything that you feel. So emotions, it's emotional. It's where we feel emotion. It's where we store emotional memory. It's where we process what makes us have what you can arguably say is a soul. So why is it that when I smell cookies, I think of, comfort and deliciousness and the holidays or something like that? Why is it that when I see the face of somebody I love, when I see the face of somebody I love, even in picture form, why does it trigger a cascade of feelings associated with the visual information? So that is something to be discussed a little bit further, but it's so incredible that there's the mechanical side of, okay, I see somebody, I hear you, I'm tasting this cookie, whatever, I'm smelling this thing, and then how, when it's transferred to this metasensory area of your brain, it's interpreted as taste, touch, sound, but then the limbic system, the part where a message might be sent to the feeling center of your brain, might elicit a sense of, remember that person. That person is somebody you love. And so then it will trigger a cascade of neurotransmitters such as oxytocin or dopamine or things that make you feel good, in addition to the fact that you have seen somebody. So it's a pretty cool cascade of events that happens from start to finish. But in any case, I'm just kind of talking about the cool parts, but we'll get into that. So rods and cones, back to the eyeball. So the mechanics of the ear, for instance, are going to be very similar, except you have like the eardrum, the cochlea, and cilia and things like that in your ear. So if you take an anatomy class or if you want to learn a little bit more about it, the machinery is different for different senses, obviously, but the basic information after the mechanical pieces is the same. So for the eye, you have rods and cones, and I'm sure you've heard these terms before. Your rods and cones are going to be both in the retina of your eyeball. So your eyeball is here, your retina is back here. So you've got, so the images get, they go into your eyeball and they get imaged back on, or they get reflected onto the back of your eyeball, which is where your retina interprets information. The rods are going to be the black and white center, and the cones are going to be the color center. The rods and cones are aplenty, and the cones are not as aplenty. Cones are going to be more central. So here's a picture of this density of where the rods and cones are. In the center part, so the angular separation from the fovea, so the center of your eyeball, the cones are going to be incredibly dense in the center of your eye. And as you go further out from the center of your eye, you have increased rod density, which means, translation, ding, 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 your peripheral vision is going to be based on your rods. So night driving, for instance, you will not have acute vision at night. You won't be able to see as well as you would, in terms of intensity, but you will be able to see better at night because you have more rods. And so actually your peripheral vision is incredibly good at night because of the fact that your rods are going to be taking over your eyesight, because your cones are not really being used at nighttime because of the fact that there's less color. Okay, back to this diagram again. So you're going to have, the rods are going to interpret black and white data, and the cones are going to be deciphering color. And the basic mechanics of all of your sensory experiences are going to be pretty similar. You're going to have your differences at the site of the experience. So for your eyeballs, you're going to have rods and cones. For your ear, you're going to have your eardrum that's going to vibrate, and then your cochlea is going to interpret some of that sound. So then the cilia will vibrate and send some action potentials. For your vision, the rods and cones are going to interpret light intensity, and the amplitude of sound is going to be determined by how fast the cilia is moving. So the different mechanics are going to be different, but the after the initial input of the sensory experience, everything's pretty similar after that. So then you've got your ganglion cell. So you've got your initial experience right here, and then information, whether or not if it's if it's enough or not enough, you're going to get an action potential or your gradient potentials to be a summative experience so that you get an action potential. Then you get your signal kind of generated, and it's going to go down your ganglion cell to the so you get your primary. You're going to have your first neuron going to the ganglion to the spinal cord, and then you're going to have that going to translate up into the thalamus, and then that's going to go to your somatosensory processing center. So that's pretty much the same thing for every single sense. The cool part is going to be discussing along the way the interruptions that can happen. So you can get your wires crossed, you can have different parts of the processing center itself in your brain actually damaged, which means that the information can get there, but there's no part of the brain to actually interpret that. So, you know, that's where you're going to, or the wiring that goes to the limbic system. So you might see and experience and process, but not have any emotions that are attached to what you're seeing or hearing or tasting. So those are kind of the areas that are, I think, most interesting to me. So you can kind of have this experience of having your senses totally intact, and then it's meaningless if it doesn't actually, inside the brain, translate to some kind of meaningful experience. So, or even more interesting still is having your memory damage, the hippocampal region of your brain, which we'll talk a lot about in the next unit, how you can see something all the time and still have no memory of what it means is also interesting. So it becomes quite clear that the brain is an incredibly complex machine. Being able to see, hear, taste really carries no meaning unless you can put meaning to it. So a discussion of the limbic system and a discussion of the memory centers of your brain have become quite important. So but for now, since we are talking just about the sensory experience, I want you to congratulate yourselves for watching a whole video about all of this, and that your faculties were about you, and that your eyes were working and your hearing is working, and hopefully you took some notes and you have at least a good overview of what we will be covering in this next unit. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will be able to get further into it as we go along. Thanks.